Hey everyone! Today, we're going back in time to see what life was like in medieval towns. When the Germanic tribes took over the Roman Empire, they weren't used to city life. They preferred living in the countryside instead of in towns. Many Roman cities were already struggling, and after the Germans arrived, they lost even more importance. Some towns were completely abandoned, while others got smaller and weaker, losing the independence they once had. At that time, living in a town wasn't much different from living in a small village. Most people were farmers, and everything was controlled by a local lord. He made the rules, chose the officials, and settled arguments in his own court. The only big difference between a village and a town was the size. For a long time, this was just the way things were. During the early Middle Ages, feudalism was growing, and nobles were busy protecting their land from invaders like the Saracens, Hungarians, and Northmen. But in the 10th and 11th centuries, things started to change. Travel became safer, which allowed trade and craftsmanship to grow again. People in towns weren't just farmers anymore, they became merchants and artisans, selling goods and creating new products. With trade came money, and places like Italy and southern France became wealthy. Some people made fortunes by trading with Constantinople and Egypt, or by transporting crusaders and pilgrims to the Holy Land. With wealth came the desire for freedom. From the 11th to the 13th centuries, towns across Europe started fighting for independence from their lords. Some paid for their freedom, while others had to fight for it. Sometimes, nobles and religious leaders saw the benefits of working with the towns, but other times, they resisted and tried to hold on to their power. In Germany and Italy, kings weren't strong enough to interfere, so towns had to figure things out on their own. In France, however, kings helped towns gain power because it weakened the feudal lords. But once the kings became powerful enough, they made sure the towns didn't become too independent. This is how medieval cities slowly grew. In Italy, cities like Venice, Florence, Pisa, and Genoa became important centers of trade, art, and learning. They also produced famous explorers like Columbus, Cabot, and Vespucci, who later discovered new lands. In France, people built incredible Gothic cathedrals that still stand today. And in Germany and Holland, skilled workers developed the printing press, which helped spread knowledge and education around the world. Medieval towns and their hard-working people played a huge role in shaping the world we live in today. But what exactly were they fighting for? What rights did they win that changed everything? Even small victories made a big difference back then. Some townspeople were allowed to pay a fixed amount in taxes instead of whatever their lord demanded. Others could handle their own legal disputes instead of going to the lord's court. Some even won the right to collect wood from the forests for free. In some towns, people gained even more freedom. They could elect their own judges and officials, which made them nearly independent. These self-governing towns, called communes, had their own laws, money, and even fought their own battles when necessary. The biggest difference was that power didn't belong to just one ruler. It was shared by the people. This gave townspeople experience in running their own communities and helped prepare the world for future democracies, where governments would one day be, as Lincoln put it, of the people, for the people, and by the people. But it would take many years for things to really change. In the meantime, the townspeople didn't always use their new power wisely. Many wealthy merchants and leaders focused more on protecting their own interests than helping others. Sometimes they treated the poor just as badly as the feudal lords did. This led to conflicts as the poor and powerless tried to gain a voice, while the rich fought to stay in control. Some of these rivalries lasted for generations, like the famous family feud in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. In Italy, towns split into two powerful groups, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. At first they fought over real political issues, but over time, their rivalry became more about identity than beliefs. People showed their loyalty in small ways, by how they cut their fruit, the colors of the roses they wore, and even how they spoke or dressed. Their fights sometimes became so violent that the people in the town couldn't take it anymore. To stop the chaos, they would bring in an outsider to rule for a while and restore peace. With so much fighting within, It's not surprising that these independent towns eventually lost their freedom. In France, the king took control, while in Italy, powerful local rulers, sometimes called tyrants, took over. Even though they lost independence, the towns remained busy, full of hard work and everyday life. A young peasant arriving in a medieval town for the first time would have seen a world very different from the countryside. Huge stone walls surrounded the city, with turrets along the top and a drawbridge at the entrance. Inside, the streets were narrow and winding, lined with tall, steep-roofed houses, each with a small garden. Unlike Roman homes, which had open courtyards, medieval houses were packed close together and built several stories high. The streets were unpaved and muddy, and there was no sewer system. After dark, the city became dangerous. There were no street lights, and the city watch might stop you if you were out too late, asking why you were still wandering around. During the day, though, the town was full of activity. Different types of workers had their own streets. Goldsmiths in one area, tanners in another, with cloth merchants, butchers, blacksmiths, and armorers each having their own sections. Shops were small and built into the lower floors of houses, with goods displayed in windows for people walking by to see. In a goldsmith's shop, the owner and his wife called out to customers, hoping to attract buyers. Inside, workers and apprentices melted gold, mixed alloys, and shaped jewelry and other fine items. Some pieces were decorated with enamel or set with gems, all made by hand in the same small shop. Every trade worked this way. Everything was made in one place. Boys who wanted to learn a craft became apprentices, training under a master for years before they could join the guild. An apprenticeship could last 10 years, during which time the boys lived with their master's family, received no pay, and could be punished if they disobeyed. But compared to working in the fields, it was an improvement. At least they had food, shelter, and the hope of one day making a living on their own. After finishing their training, apprentices became journeymen, free to work for any master they chose. Some traveled from town to town, learning new skills along the way. Eventually, the most ambitious would save enough money to open their own shop, hire workers, and maybe even become respected members of the town. The wealthiest and most successful could gain real power, helping to run the city. Beyond the workshops and crowded streets, churches and chapels filled the town. The grandest of all was the cathedral, towering above the city with beautiful stone carvings and magnificent architecture. People spared no expense in making these buildings impressive, hoping to inspire awe in anyone who saw them. At the heart of the city stood the town hall, or belfry. It wasn't just an office, it was a symbol of the town's strength. Its tall, fortified tower served as a final defense in case of attack, while the great bell rang to warn of danger, fires, or approaching enemies. But it was also part of daily life, ringing in the morning and evening to mark the start and end of the workday. At night, it rang the curfew to remind people to put out their fires and go to bed. Inside the town hall were meeting rooms for city leaders, dungeons for prisoners, and locked vaults holding the town's money and most important documents, especially its charter. This document, which proved the town's rights and freedoms, was its most valuable possession. Even on an ordinary day, a medieval town was a busy place. But during a fair, it became something extraordinary. Once or twice a year, merchants arrived from far and wide, setting up stalls along the streets. Shops filled with goods from distant lands, and people from surrounding villages came to buy and sell. The streets overflowed with activity, rich townspeople shopping, knights on horseback making their way through crowds, and merchants loudly advertising their goods. One shopkeeper and his wife showed off colorful fabrics, while workers unloaded crates of goods. Nearby, a money changer carefully weighed coins to ensure fair trades, and a beggar sat by the roadside, hoping for a few spare coins. The fair also brought entertainment. In one corner, acrobats and jugglers performed tricks, while musicians played lively tunes. Tall towers and pointed rooftops loomed over the crowd, and the spire of a distant church rose into the sky. These fairs captured the energy of medieval towns, places full of trade, ambition, struggles, and opportunities.